I was mentioning a moment ago when we were just walking in here, Melanne, besides being a great person, is a nice person, and that's not a usual combination. And like nice people, she said, "How's your daughter?" Whatever. She remembered everything about her and how she had studied math. And I said, she's great, and she's writing about technology and doing things. But I said, it's interesting to do the thought experiment of what women of that generation, just coming out of college, what it would be like had there not been people like Melanne Verveer that paved the way, and others. And I look at this room, and this room is filled. I mean, I could go down the rows and name every one of you who's helped pave the way. And it's just particularly nice to see how much more we still have to do, but how much has been accomplished by people like Melanne. And I hope that my daughter's generation, I know that she was canvassing for Hillary, so she's not one of the millennials that, can't figure out where history's arc came from. But it's just really important to remember it was a hard push to keep getting here. And so with that, I want to turn it over to the people Peggy Clark, who hired me, basically. My daughter and I came in here quietly on a Saturday when I was trying to plot my exit strategy from CNN, and she met me. And your daughter was with, and they all talked, and Betsy said, "This is the place, Dad." And so, Peggy Clark.
Thanks, Walter. Appreciate that, Walter. Thank you, and welcome to Aspen. We're delighted, again, as always, to have these wonderful events with our Aspen community. We know how busy your lives are, particularly Melanne, to come over here and speak with us about your fabulous book is great. I want to give a shout out, Alma, you and your husband, Joe, would you stand up for 1 second? Alma Gildenhorn, she won't stand up, but she made this whole series possible. She is a woman of immense power and really thoughtfulness in so many ways, so we're so grateful. I do want to say, every so once in a while in your life, you meet people who really move mountains, and all you want to do is just say, "I'm with you. I'm right behind you. I'm with you. I'm standing beside you the whole way." Jane Wales and Melanne Verveer are that. In my own life, I would say that the difference that Jane and Melanne have made is to make it possible for people like myself and others in this room to do what we continue to do and will be doing into the future. Their accomplishments are remarkable. I will not go into all of them because there are too many, but I do want to give a special thanks to Melanne for writing this book. We wanted you to write this book, and we were waiting for this book to come out, and it tells some really important stories, and it's a great book. So please, all of you, feel free to get a signed copy with Melanne afterwards. Melanne has so graciously helped us with a number of things here at the Institute. Melanne sits on a wonderful advisory board on the Alliance for Artisan Enterprise, which is working with women entrepreneurs all over the world, for which we're very grateful. As many of you know, Melanne is the first head of the Office of Global Women's Issues at the Department of State in the Clinton administration. She's now at Georgetown University. She founded Seneca Women. She founded Vital Voices. There are many, many things that she did. And Jane Wales is my colleague here at Aspen. And you may not know this, Jane, but I'm Vice President of Policy Programs, so every quarter we review what the policy programs are doing. And we just say, what? Jane has she really been in Abu Dhabi talking about XYZ? And she's a remarkable person who has done so many things, Jane, and we're so grateful for what you do. Jane now runs our philanthropy and society work here at the Institute. She's a vice president. She also was the founder of the Global Philanthropy Forum. She served in both the Carter and the Clinton administrations. And, I didn't realize this until today, Jane, that you were the executive director of Physicians for Social Responsibility when they won the Nobel Peace Prize. She also did a little moonlighting, executive director for the Elders when it was being founded. So I don't need to say any more. These two women are heroines of mine. I love that we're going to have a conversation between you two today. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peggy, and thank you to all of you. We have a sold-out crowd, and Walter was absolutely right, and Peggy was absolutely right. You look out here, and you almost wish you were all on the stage because it would be so valuable. Melanne, I want to start by first asking you why you chose to write this book at this moment.
Well, maybe I shouldn't say anything more. Can we put that mic down? Let me say from the start, what a pleasure it is for me to be back here at Aspen. Walter has been such a leader on so many issues, and I mentioned him in the book, and I told him this because in the book he did about the internet and computers and the history, he gives just due to women and the prominent role they played. You would never know that women were at the beginnings of the whole foundation and process going forward, but they were, and I thank him for that because now we're having a tough time getting a lot of women into STEM and moving forward. To have our Honorable Secretary here, Mr. Glickman, thank you so much, and for all the work that you do on food security and so much more. We owe you a huge debt. Peggy and I have worked a lot on the artisans issue and how to connect artisans with the business community, the makers with those who can sell their products. And I just want to say, I know this is a long way of going to a question, but Jane means a great deal to me. What she started more than a decade ago called the Global Philanthropy Forum was the first time that there was a real concerted effort to bring the private sector together with the philanthropy sector, largely the nonprofit sector. And today we know that's how we go about making things happen. It was a vision back then, and you really brought that vision to an incredible, realistic place, and I think so much has grown out of that. Now, why this book? And Alma, thank you for being here, because Alma's been such an inspiration on all matters, particularly cultural matters. I wrote this book with my co-author. We're two generations. She comes out of the media world. She's a lawyer. She's been seeing the world through different experiences than I have. And both of us realized that a lot of what we had been thinking and working on was a shared set of experiences. And that is to understand that we are at a pivotal place today, we believe, despite all of the challenges, that we can exponentially grow progress for women and girls. And we can do that because today there are more women than ever before, and I look at this room and the achievement that each and every one of you represents, more women than ever before around the world who are in positions where we can make a difference. We don't have to be the partners. It's nice when it happens, or the directors on the boards, but at middle management, even at the grassroots level, there are things happening where women are on the front lines of change. And the book goes into women situated in all of those places, not just the top, as pivotally important as the top is in terms of modeling and in terms of power. But beyond that, we have an evidence-based case like we've never had before. The data is in. The data is strong. It comes from the private sector. It comes from the multilateral world. It comes from the World Economic Forum and the World Bank, and it comes from McKinsey and Deloitte and Goldman Sachs. And that basically says, in terms of economic prospects for our world, we cannot get there. We cannot create the kinds of jobs, grow economies, realize inclusive prosperity if it were not for women's economic participation, and we have a long way to go on that. But we've got the case. We've got the case in so many areas of social progress, educating a girl, for example, and what the tremendous payoffs for that are. So the data is important, and we can talk a little bit. In my own experience, it's certainly something that springs from where I sit and where I think each of you sits, which is this is fundamentally the right thing to do, women's equal participation, full and equal participation. But there are a lot of skeptics out there who don't see why it's worth it. It's the nice thing to do, but is it really the important thing to do? And that evidence-based case is critical for winning over the skeptics. And we had a formulation we used all the time, and now I hear it wherever I go, at the State Department, which is this is the right thing to do and the smart and strategic thing to do. And now we can make the case incontrovertibly on the smart and strategic side. And then thirdly, we are connected like never before. With all of the technological breakthroughs that have occurred that we all take advantage of, and the kinds of instant linkages we have anywhere in the world. I wake up in the morning and my emails are from everywhere and then some. We can organize and connect and make a difference as we never have. And so it was for those reasons and the recognition that increasingly today women are using their power for purpose. And I look at you and I see that in spades. Really wanting to make a difference, not leaving your day job, so to speak, but doing it from where you sit. And the book focuses on a number of women in strategic positions, particularly in the private sector, who are making tremendous breakthroughs by putting issues on the table, by creating initiatives, by moving their companies or their organizations in ways that move the needle considerably. And I wanted to take those experiences, those learning processes, and their stories. We interviewed some 75 people, some men as well as women. This book is about men as well as women. It's not an anti-male book. We can't make it without the good men. And really to learn from their experiences as well. And we saw this confluence of the train heading down the same track.
So let me go back to the data for a moment. Because you start out the book with women as economic actors, and not just in the boardroom and the C-suite, but also as consumers, as workers. But talk a little bit about worldwide, what is their purchasing power looking like, number one, and number two, as they move into, if they were fully integrated, for example, in the job force, labor force, and stagnating economies like Japan, what would it look like? Or troubled economies like Egypt?
Well, first of all, it's not a zero-sum game. Women doing well economically doesn't mean that men are going to have less opportunity. This is everybody moving forward. And there are various data points. The most comprehensive was released several weeks ago by McKinsey, and it said that some 12 trillion, that's with a T, to 28 trillion could be driven into the world economy based on women's participation. But there are a number of obstacles, and we can go into what some of those obstacles are. But basically, their first number has to do with best in the region. So if you were to look at Latin America, for example, best in the region economically, let's say is Chile, if everybody got up to those standards in terms of women's economic participation, what that would unleash. We know the World Economic Forum, and I look at Laura Listwood here, who's been involved with the WEF over many years. They put out an annual gender gap report. Now, do they put that report out because they're a women's organization? Hardly. They would never be accused of that. But they put it out for a reason. They look at 100 and some countries, and with 4 metrics, access to health, education, economic participation, and political, look at where those countries are in closing the gap between men and women's progress in those 4 categories. They do it because where that gap is closer to being closed, and nowhere is it closed, but where it is closer to being closed, those economies are far more competitive and far more prosperous. And you might say, well, that's just rational, because you're using all of your talents, not a part of your talents, to make that happen. Jane alluded to other ways. There are barriers to women in the workplace. If those barriers were removed, even in the United States, we could grow our GDP, and the numbers range from about 4% or so for the United States to double digits, exceeding double digits in the Middle East, because of the differential in moving women forward in that space. In terms of how women spend their money, women tend to spend upwards of 90% of their income on their families, on sort of essential needs, education, health. That gets plowed back into the community. So it's called the multiplier effect. It's like a double dividend. So we benefit enormously from the way that those dollars are spent. Purchasing power. If you're a business today, this is a win-win for business, and business is involved for two reasons. One is it's about the bottom line, and that's what business is about. But secondly, it spins off all this shared value, and that's where I feel this is a very strong case. But for them, you look at purchasing power today. It's something at like $24 trillion and growing. Women control purchasing power the world over. If you're a business, you need that market. You're not going to get that market if you're just having a bunch of guys designing the products you want to sell who don't have any sense of what a woman might buy. That's where we get mistakes like pink computers. Well, what woman do we know would buy a pink computer? But that's just sort of the exaggerated example. But there is a recognition today that the diversity is an advantage, and it's an advantage in business because you need this wealth of experience and talent and perspective, and you need that brought to bear on your services or products, whatever you're producing, because there is this vast market out there that's growing. So it's a whole lot of, we try to not make it a data-driven book, but data is very much a key component of it.
And we are seeing the impact on the bottom line for some of these Fortune 500 companies. Talk about, we are seeing more women in the C-suites and in the boardrooms in the Fortune 500 companies, but they don't seem to get quite beyond 16% or so. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's almost like there's a 17% ghetto in every area. And I didn't realize this with respect to the media until Gina Davis, who's also in the book because media is an influence, pointed it out, which is in crowd scenes, where men and women, just crowds, no particular differential. About 17% will be women in crowd scenes. You know, you ask yourself, given it's 50% more or less, where are the rest of them? And maybe we just get used to 17%. But the reality is we still do have a long way to go. I don't want to harp on the fact that it's all a bowl of cherries out there. It's not, but we have greater capacity today to achieve it. For example, on boards of directors, Catalyst, which is one of the preeminent research organizations in terms of particularly women in business, have pointed out that where there are 3 women on boards of directors, that's the critical mass, 3, one alone isn't quite there by herself. But where there are 3, and they've measured, and that's the case for 5 years, say, that the return on equity is much higher. The profitable margins of the companies go up. So again, it's a benefit, and I think not until certain parties begin to see what women can bring to the table as beneficial to them, will we necessarily get there. And I think that goes to human nature. We operate in our self-interest. Think about it. You know, much of our motivation is what's in my self-interest. And so if we begin to make our arguments about this being in a company's self-interest, it's more likely that we might head in the right direction. Now, there are a number of initiatives going on today to get more women on boards, and some are mandated. You know, Norway, for example, did it by a quota. Others are not. What's happening in the UK and spreading to the United States is quite interesting. The 30% Club is trying to get to 30%. They are doing it through sort of persuasion as opposed to a hard limit, and they are likely to meet their goal next year for the original goal they set. But they've got very prominent men involved. They have a lot of male champions, and they're able to make the case, I think, quite impressively.
You talked earlier about combining power with purpose and sort of transforming the companies in which they work. Talk a little bit about the Coca-Cola company, for example, what it has done when it comes to diversifying the supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Well, Coca-Cola, I think, is a very interesting example of the CEO, Muhtar Kent, who has completely got religion on this issue, if I can put it that way. He really sees women as the dynamic economic force in the world today. And he put pressure on the women in the company who are in significant numbers, and actually created a president's council, if you will, and gave them the charge to really think big about what more the company should be doing to grow women's progress and also grow the company. And the first time that they got the charge, they had a time certain to report. And when he saw their recommendations, he said, "This doesn't go far enough. I want you to think more significantly, more strategically." And they upped the ante, and they just announced last week paid paternity leave program benefits that the company has put in place that came through in large measure, through both younger people in the company working with the more senior members to say why this was the time and why it fit and why it was conducive to the business. They made the business case as well as the personal case. But they've also created something called 5 by 20. It's a remarkable initiative to create 5 million new female entrepreneurs by 2020. And they announced this some years ago, and they've been tracking it in a very data bottom line driven way to make sure they're meeting their goals. What 5 by 20 does, the way they're going about it, is they're using their whole value chain. So a company, for example, a company like that is involved in fruit juices beyond its other products. Agriculture is part of its value chain, and they've done remarkable things to train women, to grow women's capacity so that they are becoming the backbone in very successful ways. Their income levels have grown exponentially in their juice category, mango juice, for example. They are involved in distribution as any company. They're involved in marketing. They're involved in recycling. Across this whole value chain, there have been opportunities to grow women's entrepreneurship. So a woman somewhere in a very poor place selling maybe 2 bottles of water, a couple of other drinks, is on her way now to really beginning to have a small business. And it's using the benefits of that value chain and all that it results in to enable her to take off. Now, it is a win-win. It's part of a business strategy, but it is really becoming embedded in also bringing extraordinary value to women economically. So it's an example with leadership, leadership at the very top, leadership on the part of key senior women in the company who are numerous, as well as a sense within the company, we're all in this together, and getting behind this major initiative as well as others.
And does Walmart have a similar focus on the supply chain?
Walmart, interestingly, has a major initiative, and it's a tripartite one. I happen to know it well because one of the things we did at the State Department was really create these public-private partnerships, recognizing that the private sector has competencies government doesn't have, has resources government doesn't have, but together, if we share a goal, to see what each can bring to achieving that goal. Shelley Porges is here. I noticed Shelley. And she was involved in this in significant ways of growing women's entrepreneurship. Because in terms of the interests of our country, our economic goals, where there is the benefits of progress economically, that's less of a problem for the world. It doesn't create the same kinds of tensions. So this was very much part of economic statecraft to try to grow women's entrepreneurship. And why women entrepreneurs? Because, again, data shows that women are like catalytic agents when it comes to this kind of economic participation. In terms, even in look at our economy, small business, medium-sized business drives growth. You've got big companies, you've got micro, all important. But the World Bank calls this the missing middle. In large parts of the world, there isn't this capacity that needs to be for the kinds of economic growth. So small and medium-sized businesses driving entrepreneurship was a big part of our goals. Walmart committed to purchasing $20 billion worth of goods and services from female-run businesses in the United States. And they are on the track to achieve that goal. And to double their purchasing overseas. Now, Walmart is as big as many countries. It's a big, big operator. And there are pluses and there are minuses. But in this instance, using their supply chain, because they sell products, they need services, and they are doing that buying through their supply chain. They are sourcing from women-owned businesses. The second thing they've done with this major initiative is to train for retail, train in agriculture, and train factory workers, all with an eye to moving up the ladder. And that is happening predominantly in the emerging economies in the developing world. Thirdly, they have a softer target, but a target nevertheless, that in the businesses they're doing for legal services, for accounting services, for whatever kind of services a big company needs, that they are saying to the heads of the firms who are their clients in this respect or whom they've hired, put an emphasis on women's leadership in what you're providing us. So again, it's using the power of a company to grow the possibilities in this respect. When the United States was preparing for the Summit of the Americas, which has been going on now, I think, at least for 20-some years, and when the countries come together and look at mutual goals, there was a huge emphasis, and the Inter-American Development Bank is a real example of that under Luis Moreno now, which is hugely, significantly focused on growing women's economic opportunity and participation. There was an announcement at the Summit of the Americas that involved Walmart, that involved several other companies, that involved NGOs who were in positions to catalyze women with opportunities in companies, as well as the Inter-American Bank, because capital is a very big issue, and they were in a position in terms of the financial access, and the U.S. government. And that was a major, major initiative. It's playing out as we sit here in terms of a much, much more intensive investment in women's economic participation. So this coming together of various sectors of society, which you know better than anybody, Jane, is something that is, I think, a big part of the engine behind this.
So let's talk a little bit more about the role of governments, both in setting norms and catalyzing these kinds of partnerships. The government in which you served and the State Department in which you served put a new priority on raising the status of women, increasing their economic and political power. Tell me what led to that choice. Tell us what led to that choice. But also what levers you used most, you and the Secretary.
Well, I think it was evolutionary. It didn't have just, voila, we're going to do that, but it was certainly understanding over time how this space was growing. Secretary Clinton was clearly instrumental, but it was something that she had learned over many years. In the time that I worked with her when she was First Lady and spent time crisscrossing the United States as well as the world and really understanding the significant role that women were playing sometimes against the greatest odds. And if those odds were reduced, there's no telling to what would be possible. And I think when she got to state, she really understood that this has to be a part of how we engage. In those spaces where women are oppressed or denied their rights in significant ways, usually it is those conditions that lead to far worse, instability and then conflict. And if that's one part of the overall international engagement. The other part has to do with protection of human rights, has to do with economic participation, has to do with being present at peace tables in negotiations to understand that the full perspective and range of experiences are there to address our problems. So she's very much committed to this. And when I was named ambassador for global women's issues for the first time, and thankfully now that goes forward, she said to me, this is not about nice initiatives. They're wonderful. You can do projects. People will benefit from projects. But we need to think strategically how we use the full range that is the mission of the State Department in all of these ways that we engage in our embassies around the world, through our embassies, and we engage in terms of the bureaus and offices. What would happen to our outcomes? What would make them more effective if we factored in the perspectives of half the population as well as their participation? So it was working with colleagues to really move this forward. And it wasn't so much, all kinds of work went on. She initiated the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, which was patterned on what the Defense Department did every 4 years, but now we were doing it at state, and she did it for the first time. And if one were to go back and look at that plan for the future, these issues are very much integrated into that overall plan. Guidelines were proposed, but I think in the end, what mattered most was colleagues, our officials, seeing how much more effective we would be when we actually factor these issues in. So there's a huge thrust today, and I think a recognition, first and foremost, that no country can get ahead if it leaves half of its people behind. There is no way. And that if we're going to really solve some of the great challenges before us, whether they have to do with security or with governance or with climate or with the economy, we cannot take this vast talent pool around the world and continue to keep it on the margins. We really have to make half of our populations a big part of how we go forward and solve our problems. So just a snapshot of how this happened. It happened in myriad ways, but one way was a colleague of mine had come to me at State, and he said, well, APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, we engage in that multilateral platform as we do any number of multilateral platforms. And he said, are you sending anybody from your staff? And I said, well, why should I do that? And he said, well, they usually have some women's thing. And I wasn't going for this some women's thing. And I said, well, let me study the materials. And I looked, there was no role for women in the economy. It just wasn't on the agenda. And at the same time, I'm having these statistics hit me like $90 billion is lost annually in GDP in the region because women's potential isn't being tapped. And I'm told since, I've been told since by many economists, that was an underestimate for what goes on. And so what we did was try to figure out, could we begin to push forward these issues on the APEC platform? And I asked him what I could do. And he said, well, there's going to be a meeting in Tokyo. All my counterparts will be there. We're going to start the plans. Tokyo that year had the baton. It is transferred every year. It moves to a different member of APEC. It was in Japan's hands. He said, you can come and you can raise the issue. It was like pacifier. So I went and I made a pitch. There were fewer people than all of you, but the distinguished representatives of these economies, 21 economies. And when I finished, the first gentleman who came up to me said, you talked about growth. And I thought, well, what's interesting about that I did that? And I think what he thought is I would get up there and preach the Feminist Manifesto and, that would be it. But it was really beginning to understand, and I think this is what we owe each other and part of why I wrote the book. There's a lot here, and it's not a women's issue. It's about all of us. It's about all of society. And after that, in the small and medium-sized enterprise part of APEC that year, the women's economic issue became a significant part. And I write about her as well. Kathy Matsui was working for Goldman Sachs. Kathy is an Asian American who has lived for more than a decade in Tokyo now. And she wrote, based on the experiences of many of the professional females in Japan, many whom she knew, who were not participating in any significant ways. She did a study called Womenomics and based it on what Japan would gain if it began to remove these barriers and these social mores, the cultural mores that they were all bound by, mostly women staying home with their children for 17 years, and how that needed to change if what you pointed out initially, Jane, in terms of the stagnation of the economy was going to change. And she said, you know, my study basically sat on a shelf for years. Now, interestingly, her company, Goldman Sachs, looked at that study and said, there's something here we should do. And they created a major initiative called 10,000 Women, which invests around the globe in women's, matching women to business schools and giving them crash opportunities to really learn how to do a business plan, how to do all of the things that perhaps nobody's taught them to do so that they can grow their efforts. And they also study the bottom line significantly, as you would expect, and found that in those instances, the women's income has gone up, and they have hired, and this is that missing middle, they have hired many more people, so they've created jobs. Long story short, what came out of APEC Japan then got reinforced in significant ways because the United States had the helm of APEC the following year, and together with our counterparts in the economies, created the first ever Women and the Economy component of APEC, which goes on, has made extraordinary, taken extraordinary steps, has goals of all the economies to do better in this space. And with them, it's a focus on removing the obstacles, or getting at the obstacles. And those obstacles are access to capital, access to markets, training, mentoring, the kinds of things you need to be successful. In Japan's case, that was APEC's case. In Japan's case, Prime Minister Abe has made womenomics a big part of Abenomics, and has made this a significant pillar of how Japan's economy is going to come out of the doldrums. He has been a real champion of this. It has not been easy. There's been slow progress, but in terms of the provision of child care, in terms of cajoling the companies to do a better job, in terms of really trying to use the leverage of government, in his government, he is trying to move more in this direction. So that's, the point is here, I think that today companies and countries are recognizing that this is in their interest.
Now, what I want to do is open it up for questioning, but while you're gathering your thoughts, and put your hand up because a microphone will come to you. In fact, a person will bring a microphone to you. It won't just drop out of the sky. But I did, since you were talking about the leveraging of a political office, give us a sense, do you feel women lead differently? And do you feel that they govern differently? I mean, this is a time in which we're all concerned about how effective governance can be, concerned about polarization. Do you see a difference?
You know, I hate to get into always those arguments of men being better or more competent than women and vice versa. I think what's missing, and it's missing in our politics too, significantly, and what happens when you do something about it, I'll mention in a minute. But what's missing is the talents that women represent perspective and experiences, and I underscore experiences. I'm not going to get into the hardwired biology business, but the experiences. Look at our own country. We have, 18% women in the Congress. And yet we've made incredible strides on Title IX, on issues like one of the preeminent violence against women laws in the world, on health issues. Now, that happened because women largely came together across the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, and brought their male colleagues to focus on issues that probably would not ever have been considered because they just weren't in that realm of experience that said this is an important issue. I think we have to get there on equal pay. We've got to get there on paternity leave. We are the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have paid leave policy for parents. We have to do something more in terms of our child care situation. We've got more women in the workplace than we ever have. The majority of moms with a child under 1, and yet we've got the worst hodgepodge that everybody has to struggle with to make sure that, as President Clinton used to say to us, you should be able to be a good employee and a good parent. You should be able to do both without being in conflict. So I think it's the presence of women matching the presence of the other half of the population that gives us the best product that we can put together to work on our public policy or on our business strategies or whatever we set ourselves. But we are hardly there. I mean, we are still in the minority in many significant ways, although it is growing, but we need to grow at a faster pace than we've been growing in the last century plus.
Yeah. And is this a particular moment for collaborative leadership in our country and elsewhere? Yes, please.
Hi, Melanne. Thanks so much. As always informative, always inspirational. I've known you for years now, and there's never a time. I'm Shelley Porgas, co-founder of Entrepreneurs for Hillary. We're talking a lot about economics, which, of course, is my favorite topic. But let's switch over for a moment. We know that in this country we're aspiring, some of us are at least, to having our first woman president. But you've been all over the world to so many countries. When you look around the world, we're talking about women's economic advancement. What do you see on the political side, and what do you think is the best lever that we as a group, we as concerned individuals, can do to advance women politically as well as economically?
Well, the hardest quest of all is in the area of politics. I go back to the WEF's gender gap report. If you look, they've been doing it, Laura, about a decade now. If you look at where the progress has come, it's come in health, it's come in education dramatically, some in economics, but not where it needs to be. But on politics, it's in the bottom. It is really, really hard for women to make their way in politics. Now, there are a whole lot of reasons. I think one is it's probably more difficult to share that kind of power than any other power. But women often recoil from what they call, that's so dirty, I don't want to be part of that game. I hear that a lot in different parts of the world. Also, women are up against a standard that is so hard to meet, and sometimes it expresses itself in ways that are just inconceivable because you can't imagine ever getting out of the box. And it's a woman in Uganda said to me not too long ago, she said, and she made it to Parliament, but she said, they said to me, or they will say to us as women, if you're married, why don't you stay home with your children? That's where you belong. And if you're not married and don't have a family, something's wrong with you. And that leaves no space in between. Laura has this wonderful phrase that I will always attribute to her because it is hers, and that is, it's not a matter of the sticky floor of the glass ceiling, it's a thick layer of men. and it's hard, whether it's in the economic sphere or in the political sphere, often to break through. But it is very hard. And I think, and one of the things, NDI just launched a huge initiative on the threat to women's lives in politics, because the biggest problem today has become you put your life at risk. I mean, women parliamentarians in Afghanistan, many of whom I know, don't know when they go home to their constituency whether they will be back in Kabul. You really do take, and that's just one example, you take your life in your hands often in some places when you decide that you will engage in this space. It's very tough. But I think women need networks. I think they need training, communication skills. How do I deal with, this barrage of horrible things that's thrown at me? Money. Emily's list is like an example to the world. I get asked this question over and over and over. Women don't see themselves having the same access to resources that they need to mount a campaign. And the thought that there could be an organization where you could put in small amounts of money, now obviously, what is it, 250? May not be small to some people, but just the concept that if enough people put money on somebody and then band it together, that would give her that chance to go forward in ways that she might not otherwise. I have said this, so I'm not saying anything publicly privately that I haven't said publicly, and that is, I think we need to invest more in enabling women in ways that we do worldwide through our development programs to be able to compete politically. And again, we have our cases of women who've been not good leaders politically. That's not the point. The point is that having these experiences, which the outcome of which affects women as much as it does men. What parliaments do affects women, and it affects the men, and it affects their families. But they're not part of those decisions. And that's one of the things that I think needs to be rectified. We've got to do better.
This side of the room. Yes.
Hi, I'm Kathleen McMahon with Civic Enterprises. One of the things that come to mind from your talk is that this requires an enormous culture change, politically, economically, within the private sector, within the social sector. I guess the big question is, how do we do that? And, through your examples, obviously it's happening, but how do we keep that momentum going and breaking down, often misconceptions about the importance and the significance of this work?
Well, you're right. Change doesn't come overnight, and that's certainly the experience we all know. But I think, and that's the thesis of the book, that we can make change come that much faster if we tap into some of the developments that I mentioned at the beginning. And the title, Fast Forward, it's a call to fast forward our progress collectively. Now, one way we suggest to do that is to tap tap women's power today, however that's defined, and melding this purpose with that power so that we can move in a much more directed, faster way, in all the myriad ways this needs to be done. But I think it's also a fallacy to think about some of these deeply entrenched practices as immutable, that they can never change. It's always been that way. Because one of the things I've been able to see in the roles that I have played is how change can come, even in situations that you might not think would be open to change. And one example I'll just share with you is with this terrible, terrible practice called female genital mutilation, FGM. And it does terrible things to women in terms of you can die in childbirth from it. You can be maimed in significant, painful ways for the rest of your life. And it's also degrading. It's humanly degrading. And I was in a situation in Senegal where there was at the time, a woman who had been a former Peace Corps member in Senegal, and she was deeply committed to really furthering whatever she could do there. She fell in love with the people there. And at the time we saw her, she was teaching a course on democracy training. And I was there at the time with Hillary when she was First Lady. And we didn't understand the language, but you could see they were raising their hands, they were voting, they were arguing, all the things you do in democracy. And this person, Molly Melching, said afterwards, sometime afterwards, she said, you know, the women in that program came to me one day, and they said, how do you use this thing called democracy? What do you do with it? And Molly said, well, is there anything in your life that you would like to see changed? And they said to her, well, we all go through FGM. You cannot make it as a woman if you don't subject yourself to that process. It is required of everybody. If you're going to be anybody in that society and have whatever opportunities accrue, you have to go through the practice. And so she said to them, well, why don't you start a process and see if you can persuade the critical elements in your village to begin to contemplate changing this. The hardest people to persuade were the women who did the practice, who made it happen. They went to the imam, the grand religious leader in the village. He said, there is nothing in the Quran that mandates this process. This is not a religiously based situation. They then went to the chief. All the chiefs in the village were the men. And through efforts at persuasion, over time, persuaded the leaders and the others in the village that this is not something that should be happening there the way it was happening. Now, what they did through this effort that went on for many months, and I've seen these renunciation rituals in many places now, is move the norm. The norm had been engage in this ritual. This is what we've always done. They moved the norm to the health of our women. That became the good. This perception of good was transformed into a different perception of good. It was the men who then said, we intermarry with other villages, and they led the way to the other villages to start the same process. In Senegal, this is pretty much no longer a practice. Now, early on, the leader, the president at the time in Senegal in the parliament, voted out FGM on human rights grounds. That would never alone, important as it was, alone have changed the behavioral patterns of the people. But this combination of acknowledging it, but certainly the power of the grassroots in bringing about the change has been very significant. Molly now runs an NGO called Tostan. It is operating in many parts of the world where this practice goes on, and they have been incredibly successful. Again, by sort of this community process. Does it happen overnight? No, but it is happening, and it is happening. I get reports from her, the latest place to really make progress on this. So, I think that we don't understand the capacities we have in all the places we sit, no matter how small we think those are, to really be able to effectuate change.
So we're going to have to break in a moment in order for Melanne to sign the books, the many books that you've bought. So I just want to end with one question, because you've known everybody from Molly Melching to Sandra Day O'Connor. Tell us just a word about you. What made you know that you could affect change and on this scale?
I think I grew up in a very small town, and I had a father who was my role model because he was always engaged in the community. We were the kind of community in Pennsylvania where we were always looking for the jobs creators. And, as much as I can remember as a kid, he was always out there meeting with the various sectors of the society. And I think that and the fact that he was interested in politics. He never ran for office, but politics was kind of something that could be that effector of change. If you were a politician, you really brought good things into the lives of the people. You heard them and you tried to do something. And so I went away to college, to high school, and it was that time of the ferment when you were of a certain age, when a young politician named John Kennedy was beginning to sound very attractive to people like me and many in my generation, especially ask what you can do for your country, not what your country can do for you. And that spirit really overtook me. And I'm not unique in this respect because so many of my age cohort have said the same thing. And I was reminded that when we came to Washington on our class trip in high school, I saw the spires of Georgetown, and I said, that's where I'm going to school. I knew nothing about the university. The only thing I knew was it was in Washington, and I was coming to Washington. I wanted to be a part of something bigger than myself. I mean, that's the bottom line. And all of the opportunities I've had, starting from, however they manifest themselves when you're very young, you seize if you're, if you really want to be part of something bigger than yourself. And whether it was in various NGOs I worked for a long time, or whether it's in government, it's really been the same motivation.
So please join me in thanking Melanne Verveer.
Thank you to all of you.
And so Melanne is able to stay for about another 15 minutes to sign books, so please do meet her out front.